Well, good morning. Welcome. Glad you're here. Welcome to our guests. We appreciate you coming and being here with us today. Excited to be with you. We're going to be here in Romans chapter 12, so I want to encourage you to keep your Bibles open here to that passage. We're talking during the month of February about every member being a minister. And this really comes down to real life, ordinary, daily obedience. And today's lesson really is going to track from where we left off last Sunday. We spent some time here in Romans chapter 12 last Sunday morning, and we were also in Hebrews chapter 6 where we were talking about how God does not forget our work in the Lord. In fact, the Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews 6:10 that it would be unjust for God to forget our work. How many of you enjoy traveling over a big, long bridge? I'm thinking like when you're down in Florida or maybe out in Washington State, where you have to drive. I was out in Washington State last year, drove over a pretty long bridge over the Sound out there. It's west of Seattle. I drove over the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Does anybody get kind of nervous when you drive over a bridge that's long like that? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. What's your greatest fear when that happens? Well, in 2004 in eastern Oklahoma, a bridge on I-40 collapsed after a river barge operator who was drunk crashed into one of the bridge pilings. Do you remember this on the news? It was the national news for a few days because about 15 people died. When that barge operator hit the bridge piling, the bridge literally collapsed instantaneously, and cars going westbound on I-40 just literally, the bridge fell out from under them and they crashed down into the river below. To me, that would be absolutely scary. I mean, in one moment, you're driving, and the next minute, you're flying through the air down toward the water. And it was a tragedy. Just about 300 miles to the east of there is where the river crossing at Memphis. Any of you ever been to Memphis? What do you think of when you think about Memphis? Graceland, Elvis, the Pyramid. Everybody? I've never been in the Pyramid. It's a Bass Pro Shop now. I need to go. But the river there, where you cross from Memphis into the Promised Land, Arkansas, it's about a mile wide. And the bridge there that was built in 1972, it was an engineering marvel at the time. It was a big deal that bridge be constructed, because it didn't replace a bridge, but downriver about a mile was the original bridge that was built in the interstate system back in the 50s, and it was old and narrow. In fact, that bridge is still there. But the new one, the I-40 bridge, was a big deal. And in 2022, a boater was going up the river and noticed on the I-40 bridge at Memphis this big, huge crack in the structural beam that holds that bridge up. And what's interesting is that bridge had just been inspected a few months earlier, and the inspector missed it. In fact, I think he got some charges laid against him because of that. But they discovered this. It made the news. It was national news. They had to shut the bridge down for months, and it was said that if that one steel beam had come apart, the entire structure was going to come down. Now, that's a big deal. And the thing is, if you're like me, I've driven countless times over that bridge. You never would have known it from the top while you're driving down the interstate. You would have never known that there was such a major problem. One part doing its work, and yet essential to it, unseen, but if it had failed, the whole structure would have come down. From that, we learn some simple lessons, brothers and sisters. The strength that holds things up often is hidden. And what you don't see may be the thing that matters the most. And that certainly applies to the local church. Much of what holds us together isn't visible from the surface. It's not flashy, it doesn't draw attention, but it bears weight. And it absorbs and keeps the whole structure standing. And so today as we study together, I want you to see that your faithfulness inside the local body, and it may be the unseen kind of faithfulness, it's not small, it's not secondary, and it is definitely not wasted. The promise is that through us, God is building something strong. And that is exactly the picture that is given to us in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 is where Paul shows us how God is building that. In verses 4 and 5, he tells us that the church is a body. We have many different parts and different functions, but they're all essential. Some parts are very visible, others not. But every part matters. That's the message. And it matters because every part carries its own weight. Now, last week we were in verse 6, and we looked at the first part of Romans chapter 12 and verse 6, and where Paul talks about how God has given each of us differing gifts by His grace so that the whole body can stand firm. And those verses really are a reminder of that the church is often held together by faithful people doing their work that may be unseen by the rest of us, but never goes unnoticed by God. And so as we study together over the next few moments, there are two questions that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. The first question is this: where has God placed me in the structure? Where has God placed me in the structure? And the second question is, how is my faithfulness helping hold the whole body together? All right, so keep those two questions in your mind as we study together through verses 3 through 8 of Romans chapter 12 this morning. So first, we're going to back up to verse 3, and I think it's important as we study this subject that we learn to see things from the proper perspective, and I think verse 3 helps us do that. Notice what Paul says. He says, by the grace given to me, I tell everyone among you not to think more of himself more highly than he should think. Instead, think sensibly as God has distributed a measure of faith to each one. So before Paul gets into talking about gifts of serving and all of those things where we're busy in the body, the first thing that he addresses is, how do you see yourself? And that's important, because I think there are some people out there that really begin to think highly of themselves. They might overestimate their role. They might think that they're just really important. They think that they're out there front, and that's just really good. And that's on one extreme, and then on the other extreme, you have people that really undervalue what they do as their work in the body. Now, Paul is saying here, as you look at verse 3, here on the screen, that pride or self-dismissal is not clear thinking. He instead, notice here, and this is why I had you fill in the blank there, he says, think sensibly. And what does that mean? What does it mean here in this case to think sensibly? Paul simply is saying you need to see yourself in the way that God sees you. And you need to see yourself inside the distinct role where God has placed you for the purpose of building the body together. Maybe you've been tempted to dismiss that in your own life. You show up for services, you serve others, you pray, you give, you care for others, and maybe in the back of your mind, you assume, well, that already counts for something. That doesn't matter that much. And I want to tell you that when we read verse 3, if you are prone to dismissing that is not sensible thinking. Paul is saying that God has measured to each member of the church a gift, and He has placed each of us in the place that we need to be to serve. He has placed you where you are needed. And so, as I think around, I look around this room, and I think about each brother and sister that make up this church. Some of the most faithful brothers and sisters sitting in this room today are those that you never hear much about. They're here at every service. They serve when they're asked. They pray, and if they were gone, we would definitely miss them. Immediately, we would feel it. So, we need to see ourselves for who we are. Now, let's look at verse 4, because if I'm going to see myself clearly, it's also going to mean that I see others in the body clearly as well. Verse 4, we have many parts in one body, and all the parts do not have the same function. So, notice how quickly here, go back to verse 3, look at what Paul says there, now verse 4, and I want you to see how quickly Paul is moving from how we look at ourselves to how we see others. Your work in the body does not happen in isolation. It happens together. We are connected, we are dependent on each other, and it is a shared work that we do with one another. God has never designed His church where His people act as if they're a bunch of independent contractors. We have one mission working together here. We are part of a structure that has been carefully designed, and each part contributes to the whole. This is something I think is really important because it's very popular today for some folks. Well, I can just kind of drift between congregation and congregation, and I don't have to be a member of one local congregation. I can just kind of come and go as I please. And I think if that is your approach to Christianity, you are missing out on an essential part of what God has intended for our growth and development as Christians. We function together as one, as members of a local church, and in so doing, we grow together, and we share together, and we prosper together. And so this body here has been carefully designed by God. We have been brought together at this moment in this time to do His work. That's a tremendous honor and blessing, is it not? We need to be seizing the moment. I appreciate what Matt said in his opening prayer this morning. Lord, send us to your work. And He has called us now for that work, to work together. Now, if you belong to Christ, you belong to the body. Look at verse 5. Paul says here, in the same way, we who are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. I think this is important to share as well. As a member here, you do not have to carry the whole structure. That's not what God has called you to do. Instead, what God has called you to do is to carry the part that He has entrusted you to carry. All right, so my responsibility is not the whole church. It is inside my function that He wants me to do. I need to live inside of that and do it the best I can. And I tell you, so many of you are doing just that here at Cornerstone. For example, here we are, and I kind of look around the room this morning, probably about 180, 190 of us gathered here this morning. That's good. But I want you to think just for a second about everything that has gone in to preparing this worship service that we've all taken part of to this point in the worship. Think about the action of hospitality. The doors were unlocked earlier this morning. Some of you here very early, making sure everything got turned on. Some of you were here early to help our guests be seated in the area where a lot of our guests sit. There have been connection cards that have been handed out. And all of that's part of the work of hospitality. Then I think about the preparation for worship that has already happened. Somebody got here early and put together the communion, the bread, and the fruit of the vine that we just partook of. Somebody got together and worked to make sure the bulletin was prepared in advance. And somebody worked on the song slides. And the song leader, Titus, worked in advance to prepare the songs that we've just sang. There was a lot of planning that went on in that. And then I think about all of the care for the facility. The heat is on this morning. That's a good thing, right? The heat's on. We've had various things happen here with the security, and there was some salt put down and some snow shovel. I saw Dylan shoveling snow this morning out there on the entryway. And then I think about all of you that engage in personal ministry walking in here today. A word, a hug, an encouragement. And so as you think about all of that, maybe 20 different things that all have to come together by not just one person, but multiple people here to pull off this worship service. And by the way, that's just one thing that goes on here inside this congregation. This is not some kind of program. What it is the body of members here working together in the way that God designed it to work. It's a beautiful thing. Many different people all interacting together as one with differing levels of talents and abilities, and not one of them being neglected or looked down upon. So when you take verse 4 and verse 5 together here of Romans chapter 12, what I want you to see is it's all about our attitude, how we look at one another. And really, the connection still being made back to verse 3, because no person should be looked down upon in the body because their gifts aren't as shiny or out in front as someone else's. By the way, skip down to verse 8 for a second. And I have the last part highlighted here. There's a lot of differing gifts that Paul mentions here in these verses. I want to think about for a second people in the congregation that are gifted in the ability to show mercy toward others in the church. And he says here, showing mercy with cheerfulness. Think about the person, and you all know somebody here that's an encourager, a person that if something goes down in your life, they are there to come up and give you a hug, to sit down and talk to you, to maybe take you out to lunch and encourage you, or whatever it may be. There are multiple people here that are so good at showing mercy toward others who are going through difficult times. That's an important work. That kind of work should not be overlooked. How much is that talent needed inside a local congregation? I tell you, I'm convinced that if you have a congregation full of people that can show mercy with cheerfulness, I'm going to show you a church that is growing and flourishing in its work. Would you agree? Because people are connected. People love one another, and we need that. All right? So it's crucial to our work. Although that may not look like as flashy as maybe the preacher's work, it is extremely essential. So let's move on and now look at verses 6 through 8. Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. And we want to talk for a moment or two about how faithfulness shows up in action, not just as intention. Now, this is not the first time I've ever preached on this passage. I've preached on this. I went back and checked my records, 2021. And in that sermon, what I did is I actually went through each one of these activities, prophecy, and all the things that Paul lists here between verses 6 through 8. I'm not going to do that today. I would encourage you to go back to that lesson in 2021 and listen to it. If you're into that and you want to just hear some amazing preaching, that is certainly something I would encourage you to do. What I want to do here, though, is talk about how these verses are all about action. And I want to highlight that here in verse 6. And you can fill in the blank here with any one of the gifts that he talks about. And the emphasis here is if you've been gifted with something, use it. Put it to work. Use it. Be busy in the work of the Lord. He says, if you're into prophecy back during this time, use it according to the proportion of your faith. If service, use it in service. If teaching, in teaching. In exhorting, in exhortation. Giving with generosity. Leading with diligence. Showing mercy with cheerfulness. Now, notice as you read those verses that Paul here in this text doesn't spend a lot of time explaining each gift. The emphasis here in verses 6 through 8 is his call to action. Nearly every phrase in these verses is a verb. Paul's concern here is not whether you have a gift, because you do. The concern here is, am I using it? Am I putting this to action? And notice, he's very straightforward with this. If your gift is service, then serve. If your gift is teaching, then teach. If your gift is encouraging, then do it. Encourage others. There's no comparison. There's no ranking. There's no spotlight. The call here is just faithfulness. Be busy. Use it. Go to work. What God has placed in your hands is meant to be exercised, not just admired. Now, this is important too, because our work inside the local church is not just for us. Our work is to be done unto the Lord, and we briefly talked about that last week. The church needs our work, but listen, God receives it. Your work in the Lord is never in vain, and that's what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15. Be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the Lord's work, knowing that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Now, let me ask you this, and I want to do this and not meddle, but I want to try to get you to think for a second. If I'm reading 1 Corinthians 15:58, and I'm looking for personal self-examination, can it be said of me, this is what I need to be asking, can it be said of me that I am excelling in the Lord's work? Or is it part-time? Or is it just when I get around to it? Or is it something I just keep kicking the can down the road and hope I'll get to it when I can? Could it be said of me that I am excelling in the Lord's work? Again, the emphasis going back to Romans 12:6 is use the gift you've been given. In fact, let's go back to verse 6. And I want us to look together here. Use it, all right? You have different gifts. Use it according to the proportion of one's faith. Now, according to the proportion. What is that? What does that mean? Now, I would tell you first that he is not talking about value or importance. What he is talking about here is a faithful alignment. To serve in proportion means staying in what God has entrusted you, carrying your share of the load responsibly, making sure that you serve with trust instead of strain. And so we don't inflate or neglect our role. We don't try to do someone else's role. We stay in our lane and do what God wants us to do. We be faithful to what God has given us, and we trust Him with the results. God has never asked you to do more than your share, but He is asking you to do your part faithfully and to do it well. And so, at the beginning of the lesson today, I asked you to focus on two questions. And I want to revisit those for just a second. And I want you to give consideration to your own life. Only you can answer these questions. Where has God placed me in the structure? In other words, in this local body, what's my role? What's my place? Maybe you excel at teaching our young people. Maybe you feel comfortable being a helper of a teacher in some of our Bible classes. Maybe your role could be teaching the lost encouraging those who are down. There are all sorts of different parts that it might be where you are inside the structure of the body here at Cornerstone. And then the second question I ask you to focus on throughout the lesson is, how is my faithfulness helping hold the whole body here at Cornerstone together? Now, as you think about those questions, how are you doing in answering those questions? I think God has called us here in our work not to be impressive. What He has called for each of us to be is faithful. Faithful. Faithful to the role that God has called us. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to be everywhere. You don't have to be someone else. You just need to be faithful right where God has placed you and use what He has entrusted you with. And when everybody here is doing that, this congregation will continue to stand strong, and the work will continue, and it will grow. And so the idea here that I've tried to get across this morning is very simple. It's about belonging, and belonging fully to this body. That belonging that we're talking about, it's a blessing. When we say here at Cornerstone that this is a family, that's not just some kind of empty phrase or marketing slogan that we've adopted. It's real. You believe that? Have you experienced it? Its warmth, the love of this body. There are some of us that might not be in the church today if it weren't for people here and them living inside their role that God called them to do to help us. Is that a blessing? Now, to embrace that fully, now that's what we need to be doing. Now, all of this, as we close, goes back to Jesus. And the first thing that I want all of you to think about is, how fully have I embraced Jesus? Because that's where this begins. And maybe you're with us today and you're outside of Christ. I want you to know that this is an invitation for you to begin that spiritual journey with Him. And He's going to put you in His body. You're going to be connected to so many other wonderful people that help you along the way to get home to heaven. That's what this is all about. This world is not our home. We're just passing through, and we're headed to a much better place, a place where we can be together, where there'll be no more goodbyes. We'll all be together forever with God, with the Lord, forever and ever. That is what this is all about. And if that is a place you want to be, it begins today through your repentance and your confession. You're being baptized into Christ. We can help you do that. If you need to do that today, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.